the 29th of June, 2012. A wet Friday afternoon in Toowoomba. 154 men and women walk out of a foundry gate on Ruthven Street for the last time. The last cast iron pour cools in the moulding shop. The hooter sounds. Doors lock. 141 years of casting iron on the Darling Downs ends in a single afternoon. By 2017, that gate is a Bunnings car park. The Queensland Heritage Register listed the site in July 2004. It did not save it. About 250,000 Southern Cross windmills built since 1903. 1 in 9 working Australian farms by the 1950s. How did Australia's most trusted windmill dynasty end as a hardware store car park? This is the story of a Bristol salesman, an inventor son, and a Latvian raider whose Adelaide empire collapsed. Chapter 1. The Bristol Salesman. George Washington. Griffiths was born in Bristol on the 24th of March, 1844. His father was Thomas Griffiths, a congregational minister who, according to the Australian Dictionary of Biography, became wealthy from contraband cotton during the American Civil War. Read that line slowly. The man who had found one of Australia's most iconic windmill empires was the son of a clergyman with money laundered through Confederate blockade running. That is not the way most company history pamphlets begin. GIW did not arrive in Queensland with a windmill design. He did not arrive with an engineer's training. He arrived with the family money behind him, a salesman's instinct in front of him, and a tip from a fellow passenger on the steamer Light Brigade in late 1870. The fellow passenger was J.C. White of John Darien, who lectured GW across the wardroom about the Darling Downs wool boom. Toowoomba, White said, was about to become rich. GW listened. Within a year, he had set up shop, Griffiths and Atherton, Ironmongers, Toowoomba, late 1871. He took on his brother John Alfred in 1873. The firm became Griffiths Bros & Co. In February 1876, they made the first iron casting ever poured on the Darling Downs. The character of GW is on the historical record. The Australian Dictionary of Biography is not kind. The firm did not employ designers and engineers, preferring to rely on imported designs. GW removed competition by ruthless price cutting. Essentially, the ADB says, he was a salesman rather than a manager, and often relied on injections of capital by his wealthy father in difficult times. Generous in large matters, parsimonious in small. The firm was twice saved from collapse, first by the Queensland National Bank in 1892, then by shares quietly bought in his wife Isabella's name. The Bristol money kept arriving from Thomas. This is the founder, not a genius, not a visionary engineer, a man with a Bristol upbringing, a contraband cotton inheritance, and a willingness to undercut every rival in the colony. The empire begins with a price tag, not a patent. Here is the thing. GW could buy windmill designs. His son Bert was about to design the one that beat the Americans. Chapter 2. First casting on the Downs. In 1876, in the same year as the foundry's first iron pour, the Griffiths shop built 4 direct-acting timber windmills for Sir Joshua Bell at Jimbour Station, west of Dalby. The design was copied from a Californian Daniel Halliday self-regulating wind engine, patented in the United States in 1854. The mills pumped from a station bore in a country where the surface water had failed. That is the foundation date for the windmill business. 2026 is the 150th anniversary of those Jimbour mills. Sit with that. The firm grew. On the 4th of July, 1884, it floated on the colonial market as the Toowoomba Foundry and Railway Rolling Stock Manufacturing Company Limited. The provisional director list included a man named William Henry Groome. Groome was Toowoomba's most famous newspaper proprietor and politician, and for a century afterwards, half the local histories would call him the founder of the Toowoomba Foundry. He was not. He was an 1884 provisional director. The founder was George Washington Griffiths, the Bristol salesman with the contraband money behind him. The founders of the company were often misidentified. The engineering brain inside the family was not G.W. It was John Alfred Griffiths, his brother. John Alfred was a Manchester University engineering graduate. The 1911 Encyclopaedia Britannica called him a world authority on windmill design. In 1893, in the Toowoomba pattern shop, John Alfred designed the geared Zephyr, the first geared windmill ever manufactured in Australia. Approximately 300 were built. John Alfred had already left in 1876 to work for Queensland Railways, but kept his financial stake in the firm. Engineering excellence defined the era. The site at the corner of Ruthven and Campbell Streets in Toowoomba grew through the 1880s and 1890s. The pattern shop, the foundry proper, the machine shop, the erection floor, the drawing offices. The canteen, in its later World War II era form, would eventually make the heritage citation. By the turn of the century, the works covered more than 11 acres and employed several hundred men. Heritage of the site remains. The dark side of that floor is on the record. Iron poured by hand from ladles at 1,400 degrees Celsius. Lead solder fumes in the core room. The pattern makers were the aristocracy of the floor. The moulders and casting hands were the bottom of the hierarchy. The wages reflected the rank. In 1898, a 17-year-old apprentice walked through the foundry gate for the first time. His name was George Herbert Griffiths. Everyone called him Bert. He was G.W.'s third son. Bert worked the foundry floor as designer, pattern maker, moulder and windmill erector. The ADB records that, like his uncle, Bert was inventive, even visionary, and usually initiated major developments. He rode out on horseback across the Darling Downs to erect windmills at Elora, Pittsworth, Goondiwindi, Roma and Charleville. He climbed every Southern Cross windmill he came across. The man who would design the iconic Australian windmill learned the trade by climbing every steel tower he saw. In 1902, the foundry built a model called the Eureka. It was not quite right. The Americans, particularly Airmotor of Chicago, were still cheaper. Bert was told by his elders that the firm could not possibly produce cheap mills such as the American counterparts. Bert went away and out-designed them. Chapter 3. The Constellation on the Wall. In 1903, on the floor of the Ruthven Street pattern shop, 22-year-old Bert Griffiths, working in collaboration with his uncle John Alfred, designed and named the Southern Cross Windmill. The five-pointed star logo was the constellation that hangs over every paddock from Cape York to Wilson's Promontory. The wheel was galvanised riveted steel. The head was geared and self-oiling. The tail vane swung to face the wind. The whole machine could be erected by 2 men in a day on a 4-post lattice steel tower up to 60 feet tall. It was cheaper than the American air motor. It was tougher than the local Comet. And the name was a sales weapon. No American windmill could be sold in an Australian paddock under a Southern Cross. The model lineage matters. The Eureka of 1902 became the Southern Cross of 1903. Then came the Enterprise in 1911, the A, F, G and H patterns through the 1920s, the Z pattern from 1930 to 1953. The IZ pattern from 1953 onwards, still in production 73 years later, at Whithcott. The brand became so iconic that in 1954 the High Court of Australia had to defend it. Southern Cross, Refrigerating Co. v. Toowoomba Foundry, Tai Lutted, decided on the 15th of December, 1954. Reported as 1954, HCA 82, 1954, 91, CLR 592. A company named Southern Cross Refrigerating Co., controlled by R.A. Houghton, had tried to register the name Southern Cross for refrigerators. Toowoomba Foundry opposed. Toowoomba Foundry won. Kitto J's judgment, at first instance, established what became the wonderment test of Australian trademark law, the principle that deceptive similarity exists where a number of persons will be caused to wonder whether it might not be the case that the two products come from the same source. That test is still cited in Australian intellectual property law in 2026. The Southern Cross brand was so deeply tied to Toowoomba that the High Court would not let another company graft itself onto the name. Picture the archetype. One windmill, one bore, one galvanised steel tank, 3 miles to the next homestead, the slow squeak of the gears as the southerly comes through, the groan of the vane swinging. That image, the lone Southern Cross silhouette against a country sky, was not invented for a tourist brochure. It is what working Australia actually looked. The Southern Cross was the machine that turned subterranean water into a viable farm. The branch network spread to match the silhouette. Sydney, Charleville, Townsville, Tamworth, Moree, Melbourne, Perth, then overseas. South Africa had its own Southern Cross subsidiary by 1939. New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, the peat bogs of Ireland, Iran. 100 mills were shipped back to Persia. Bert kept climbing. He erected demonstration mills at agricultural shows. He trained the Toowoomba apprentices on the floor. By 1927, the company's own catalogue was advertising the Toowoomba Works as the largest engine and windmill manufacturer in the Southern Hemisphere. The claim was repeated in the press and in the Engineers Australia citation a century later. Treat it for what it is, a proud Australian engineering company looking at its own production line in 1927 and writing what it saw, repeated for the next 100 years. The American air motor was about to find out what a tariff felt like. Chapter 4. 1 in every 9. The Lyons government brought in a 100% tariff on imported windmills in 1935. The Marawa Historical Society in Western Australia called it, in its authoritative windmill history record, the death knell for American windmills coming into Australia. Air Motor of Chicago had to license its design to be built locally or be priced out entirely. Comet of Sydney, IXL of Brisbane, Alston of Melbourne, all eaten alive by the Toowoomba operation. The 1935 tariff was the moment Southern Cross became the default Australian windmill. The cultural reach of that tariff is in the documented figures. The company tracked its mills farm by farm across Australia. About 250,000 Southern Cross windmills have been built since Bert's 1903 design. Engineers Australia's Heritage Citation gives that number. Older sources put it at over 200,000. The exact running total has never been officially confirmed. Treat the figure as about 250,000, possibly more. What is not in dispute is the share. Roughly 1 in every 9 working Australian farms by the 1950s had a Southern Cross turning over a bore. The lone mill archetype became national infrastructure. The Australian Stockman's Hall of Fame at Longreach, Queensland, has a Southern Cross R pattern, 25 feet across, mounted outside the building to symbolise the role played by these machines in the development of the outback. Lanyon Homestead at Tharwa in the ACT has an R pattern, 30 feet across, still operational. The Waltzing Matilda Centre at Winton has a 25-foot R pattern. Crow's Nest Museum, an hour north of Toowoomba, has a 1903 pattern and an A pattern, both restored. In 1924, a grazier named Mr. R. Gavin of Fernside, Menduran, in the central west of New South Wales, bought a 7.3-metre Southern Cross windwheel from the Toowoomba Foundry. He erected it over a 180-metre bore on his property. It pumped water through droughts, the Depression, the the Second World War, soldier settlement, Korean wool, decimalisation, and the 1980s rural recession. It pumped, in total, for 73 years. In 1997, Mr. Gavin's granddaughter, a Mrs. Payne, donated the windwheel to the Gilgandra Museum. That windwheel turned for 73 years on one bore in one paddock. Read that again. One machine, 2.5 generations, one source of water. There is one more hero artefact. See 16106, Southern Cross Works No. 28. Built in 1914 at the Toowoomba Foundry, a 480 steam locomotive, one of 15 C16 class engines built at Ruthven Street for Queensland Railways between 1914 and 1915. She finished her career at Cairns and was retained at the Red Bank Training Centre after the rest of the class went to the scrappers. In 2001, the volunteer Downsteam Tourist Railway and Museum at Drayton bought her for restoration. In October 2021, after a 20-year project, C16106, Pride of Toowoomba, steamed under her own power for the first time in 60 years. She runs from Drayton to Wairima every weekend in 2026. The company that built her did not survive that long. C16106 outlived the foundry by 9 years. The company exported its piece and went to war for the second time. Chapter 5. A Staff of 1,000. The First World War touched Toowoomba indirectly. Between 1914 and 1915, the foundry built those 15 C16 class locomotives for Queensland Railways. 20 light PB15 class engines had been built at Ruthven Street between 1912 and 1913. The wounded came home and went on the payroll. Leslie A. Boyce, nephew of Alfred and Bert Griffiths, was wounded in France. He joined the firm on discharge and was made a director in 1922. The Second World War is where the Toowoomba record is on solid ground. The Courier Mail of the 21st of July 1941 carried a front-page item under the headline, Toowoomba Foundry on War Work, Staff of 1,000. The announcement was made by company director L. A. Boyce, the wounded World War I veteran, now in his 4th decade with the firm. The Trove Archive holds the article, reference number 419333406. The staff number is on the public record. The Powerhouse Museum in Sydney records that 1,646 Southern Cross stationary engines were manufactured at Toowoomba between 1938 and 1945. The product mix was wider than engines: marine engines for inshore patrol boats, compressor units for forward bases, generating and alternating sets, pumping equipment. Per the State Library of Queensland, by 1941, armament industry machine tools were being manufactured at Toowoomba Foundry. The buyers were the Commonwealth Armed Forces, the United States Army, and the Netherlands East Indies. Not Bren guns, not Owen guns, not Bofors. Those were made elsewhere, at Ipswich Railway Workshops, at Rocklea, at Lysart Newcastle. Toowoomba made the engines, generators, pumps and machine tools that kept the small arms business running. At war's end, the foundry received a letter. The sender was William H. Donaldson Jr., Brigadier General, United States Army, commanding. The letter thanked the management and staff for, in his exact words, the behind-the-scenes work which is so necessary in military operations and which, more often than not, goes unrecognised. Read that again. A United States Brigadier General writing in 1945 to a Queensland engineering firm, thanking the men on the floor for the work that nobody would ever celebrate. The generating sets at the field hospitals in Port Moresby, the marine engines on Pacific supply vessels, the compressors at the army machine shops in Townsville, behind the scenes, goes unrecognised. The men who worked through it had names. Sydney Donald Don Featherstone, born 19202, died 1984. awarded the British Empire Medal, joined the foundry as a painter in 1927. He earned his St John Ambulance Instructor's Certificate while there in 1939, and later became an award-winning amateur filmmaker. Percival Clyde Percy Wilson, born 1921, worked at the Southern Cross Foundry, before becoming a share farmer at Peranga, west of Toowoomba. His Toowoomba Chronicle obituary places him on the foundry floor through the war years. Alfred Atherton Griffiths, the figures and detail brother, joint MD from 1911, chairman of the Southern Cross Associated Companies, died in Toowoomba in 1948, aged 69. The dynasty was starting to thin at the top. The country was about to change too. Chapter 6. The Last Good Decade. In 1949, the holding company structure was rebuilt. Industrial Investments, Pty Ltd, was formed to consolidate the family's interests. In 1952, it was renamed Industrial Enterprises Ltd. The foundry on Ruthven Street remained the operational heart, but the corporate architecture above it was getting more elaborate. That is the first quiet sign. When a family company starts adding holding company tiers, the family is no longer the only voice in the room. In 1953, on the Toowoomba pattern shop floor, the company launched the IZ pattern windmill. The IZ superseded the Z pattern as the standard small to medium farm mill. It is, in 2026, still in production at Whitcott, 73 years and counting. Leslie Boyce, the wounded World War I director, retired from active management in 1957 after 35 years on the board. In January 1959, Herbert Atherton Bunty Griffiths, Bert's eldest son, became Managing Director of Industrial Enterprises Ltd. He would hold the role for 25 years. The fourth generation had taken the family chair. The post-war boom was real. Farms were electrifying through the SWER lines of the 1950s and 1960s. Single-wire earth return technology pushed reticulated power further into the bush than anyone had thought possible. The Snowy Mountains scheme was finishing, and yet bore water windmills remained essential, because Australian inland bore water properties were still mostly out of reach of the electricity grid and would remain so deep into the 1980s. The R pattern, direct-acting big mills, up to 30 feet across the wheel, shipped to the Pilbara, the Channel Country, the centre and overseas. Iran, South Africa, Papua New Guinea, the Middle East. The Australian Outback windmill had become an export. Bert Griffiths watched all of it from semi-retirement. The man who had designed and named the Southern Cross in 1903 was now in his 70s, then his 80s. He still climbed the towers when he could. He still read the service complaints that came back from Charleville and Cloncurry. The ADB records his temperament: practical, modest, intensely interested in the trade, dismissive of corporate self-promotion. In 1977, George Herbert Bert Griffiths died. He was 96 years old. He had designed the windmill 74 years earlier. The man who had climbed every Southern Cross he came across did not live to see the dynasty sold. Here's the kicker. Within 10 years of Bert's death, the technology that had carried the company for 7 decades was being replaced in real time. Chapter 7. The Quiet Hollowing. Through the 1970s, the electric submersible bore pump moved through Australian agriculture, the way the windmill itself had moved through it 80 years earlier. The dairy sheds went first because reticulated power had reached them by the late 1960s. The grazing properties followed through the 1970s and 1980s, as SWER lines pushed further into the bush. The windmill did not die. It just stopped being the only option. A property that bought one Southern Cross in 1955 might not buy a second one in 1985. It might buy a submersible electric pump from Davy instead. The stationary kerosene engine, the second product line that had carried the foundry since 1908, was disappearing entirely. Diesel tractors had power take-off. Electric motors had replaced the standalone engine in workshops, dairies and pumping stations. The Toowoomba engine line was now selling into a market that had stopped existing. Then came the tariff cut. On the 18th of July 1973, the Whitlam Labor government announced a 25% across-the-board tariff cut. The 1935 100% windmill tariff that had killed air motor 4 decades earlier was now a memory. Through the 1980s, the Hawke and Keating governments accelerated the unwinding. Economic rationalism removed the structural protection that had made Southern Cross dominant. The dynasty's grip thinned. Herbert Bunty Griffiths retired in July 1984 after 48 years with the firm, 25 of them as managing director. He was succeeded by Richard Griffiths, Bunty's cousin, the fifth-generation family member to run the company, and as it would turn out, the last. In March 1984, the holding company was renamed Southern Cross Corporation Limited. The brand had become the company name. That tells you what was being valued. The brand, the intellectual property. The family business was now a portfolio. The structural premise of the entire operation had collapsed in 3 directions at once. The windmill was being displaced by electric pumping. The stationary engine was being displaced by tractor PTO and reticulated power. The tariff wall that had protected the local market was coming down. The corporate identity was being repackaged for sale. The empire that Bert had designed in 1903 and that the staff of 1,000 had defended through the Second World War was now a brand sitting on top of a thinning physical operation. The 4th and 5th generations had inherited a beautiful piece of intellectual property and a foundry that no longer made sense in its own market. In Adelaide, a Latvian-born corporate raider was building the biggest conglomerate Australia had ever seen. He was about to come for Toowoomba. Chapter 8. The Adsteam Raid. His real name was Jānis Gunnars Spalviņš. He was born on the 26th of May, 1936 in Riga, Latvia. His mother brought him to Australia in 1949, when he was 13, as a post-war refugee. He learned English on a South Australian schoolyard. He studied economics in the evenings at the University of Adelaide. In 1955, aged 19, he became company secretary of an Adelaide group called Camelec, where he stayed for 18 years. In 1973, Adelaide Steamship Company's managing director Ken Russell Head hunted him to help revitalise an old shipping line. In 1977, he was appointed managing director of Adsteam in his own right. By the late 1980s, John Spalviņš, the anglicised name he used in business, was sitting on top of one of the most aggressive conglomerates in Australian corporate history. His portfolio is on the public record. David Jones, the department store, from 1980. Woolworths Limited, a controlling stake. Tooth & Company, which owned Penfolds Wines, KB Lager and Sheaf Stout. Metro Meat, AWA. Farmers Union, Pioneer Property Group, John Martins, and Petersville Sleigh, the food group that owned Peter's Ice Cream. 4 and 20 Pies, Pura Milk, Bodella Cheese, Bird's Eye, and Nana's Frozen Apple Pies. If you are watching this channel and you watched the Peter's Ice Cream video, you already know this name. The same John Spalviņš who broke the Peter's Ice Cream empire was the John Spalviņš who came for the Toowoomba Foundry. Same raider, same playbook, same decade. The Australian Dictionary of Biography puts him in the same paragraph as John Eliot, Alan Bond and Robert Holmes, a court. The Christian Science Monitor of the 10th of April 1991 called him the last of the cowboy entrepreneurs to fall off the saddle. The Toowoomba transaction worked in 2 steps. In 1987, the Griffiths family signed the company away. After 116 years of family control, Southern Cross Corporation was sold to a publicly listed acquirer called National Consolidated, the Bristol salesman G.W., who had been bailed out by his wealthy father in 1892, the dynasty that had bought shares quietly in the founder's wife's name to survive the 1890s, that dynasty had finally surrendered the firm. By 1988, according to the Engineers Australia Heritage Record, Southern Cross Corporation was a subsidiary of Adsteam. The five-pointed star logo that Bert Griffiths had drawn in 1903 was now an asset on John Spalviņš's balance sheet in Adelaide. Out in the paddocks, the windmills kept turning. The wheel still squeaked. The vein still groaned to the south. The Mendoran mill on Mr. Gavin's property at Fernside was now in its 64th year of pumping. The lone Southern Cross silhouette against the country sky was still the silhouette. The graziers who bought a new IZ in 1988 did not know that the company on the invoice was a subsidiary of a shipping conglomerate run from Adelaide by a Latvian-born raider with billions of dollars of debt against the wall. That is the gap between what the brand said and what the company had become. Here's the problem. Within 3 years, John Spalviņš's entire empire would be the largest corporate collapse in Australian history. Chapter 9. The collapse and the foreign exile. The numbers from the Adsteam collapse have never quite reconciled. The Australian Dictionary of Biography records poor investment decisions, particularly in Bell Resources Pty Ltd and Industrial Equity Limited, led to an unprecedented loss of $1.35 billion in the 1990 to 1991 financial year. The Christian Science Monitor of the 10th of April 1991 reported a 3.7 billion Australian dollars 6-month loss, the largest in Australian history. The exact peak loss depends on which reporting period you take. What is not in dispute is the scale. Adsteam carried $6.9 billion in debt against an annual interest bill of $800 million. Close to 200 banks were involved, the largest corporate collapse Australia had ever seen. George Alexander Haynes was appointed administrator in May 1991. On the 5th of July 1991, John Spalviņš's contract was terminated. The man from Adelaide who had bought David Jones and Woolworths and Penfolds and Peter's Ice Cream and Southern Cross was off the board. In 1992, the Southern Cross Corporation was officially split. The Toowoomba Foundry, the iron pouring operation on Ruthven Street, was separated from Southern Cross Machinery, the windmill and pump business. The foundry would later be renamed Toowoomba Metal Technologies in 2001. The brand and the product line would go another way. The brand began its foreign exile. In 1998, the foundry site was acquired by Adsteam, a vehicle of former BTR Nilex chairman Alan Jackson. In late 1999, Southern Cross Machinery was acquired by Toowoomba Flow Control Pacific. In 2002, Toowoomba relocated windmill production to a new facility at Whithcott, 20 kilometres east. In October 2012, Tyco Flow merged with Pentair Water to form Pentair. The brand was now twice American-owned. In 2009, Adsteam Nilex itself went into liquidation, failing to service approximately $60 million of debt. The foundry survived the Adsteam collapse. It was sold to a private vehicle called CMI Industrial Pty Limited, ACN 129401832, registered in 2008. In April 2012, the third collapse arrived. On the 26th of April 2012, the Ford Motor Company of Australia Limited, holder of a fixed and floating charge granted by CMI Industrial on the 23rd of December 2011, appointed receivers. The judgment of Mullins J. in Re CMI Industrial Pty Ltd. Burns and Ors v CMI Limited, 2015. QSC 96 records the appointments. Administrators were appointed the same day. Matthew James Burns, Gregory John Keith, Graham Robert Killer and Michael Gerard McCann from Grant Thornton. National Australia Bank and the publicly listed CMI Limited, a separate company despite the name, held prior secured positions. On the 29th of May 2012, the company's creditors voted to wind it up. The administrators became liquidators. The Toowoomba Chronicle of the 21st of June 2012 reported the doors closing after its owners went bankruptcy. The Australian Manufacturing Workers Union Victorian Secretary, Lee Deem, gave the public statements. CMI Industrial, Deem said, was in a very bad state as far as finances go, owing between $30 million and $40 million to creditors. Workers were owed up to $1.7 million in outstanding superannuation. Deem did not name the director he blamed. He condemned him anyway. His on-record statement to Smart Company on the 30th of May 2012, it has been the bad directorship of the company director that has put these sites in this position. Obviously, he has run the company into the ground. He has performed really badly in his duty of care to all employees and to the company itself. Read that again. The Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, on the public record, naming nobody and condemning him entirely. The director's name does not appear in the free public record. The ASIC published notices archive records the corporate cascade but redacts the directorship. The Queensland Supreme Court judgment names liquidators, not directors. The director of CMI Industrial, whose conduct the AMWU described as bad directorship and dereliction of duty of care, walked away unnamed in every source available to public search. Chapter 10. The Last Cast. The exact closure date is the 29th of June 2012, a wet Friday afternoon. The last cast iron pour cooled in the moulding shop. The hooter sounded. 154 men and women, the last apprentices and pattern makers and crane drivers and yard hands of a 141-year operation, walked out of the Ruthven Street gates for the last time. A YouTube documentary uploaded in the months after closure, titled Toowoomba Foundry, Where Are They Now?, captures the workers in their own voice. The faces are middle-aged and older. The interviews are short. The shop floor in the background is silent. The patterns went to auction. Grays Online ran the liquidation sale. The casting patterns, the wooden master forms that the Toowoomba Foundry had used since the 1880s to cast specific windmill components, engine blocks, pump housings, were broken up into lots. Some of the patterns going to auction had been cast for specific Queensland stations. Some went back to the original 1876 Jimbor order. Customer patterns held in trust for ongoing service work were lost in the liquidation. Preservation community testimony, not proven trade data, records that CMI had already been sending casting work to China in the months before the collapse. The 141-year-old foundry was outsourcing its own product line to its eventual replacement. The site had been added to the Queensland Heritage Register on the 7th of July 2004. Citation 601,300. The listing identified the foundry, the moulding shop, the core shop, the pattern shop, the Brooks shed, the drawing offices and the World War II-era canteen as significant historic fabric. 8 years passed between the heritage listing and the closure. The listing did not save the foundry. It did not save the jobs. In October 2013, Bunnings Group Limited purchased the site. In July 2015, the Toowoomba Regional Council approved the demolition of much of the heritage fabric, including the moulding shop, the core shop, the Brooks shed, post-1960 additions, and a partial demolition of the cylinder head, maintenance, and machine shops. The demolition was locally controversial, and it went ahead. In 2017, the Bunnings Toowoomba North store opened on the 11-acre site at the corner of Ruthven and Campbell Streets. The only physical memorial on Ruthven Street today is the absence, a Bunnings car park, a trade hardware store. The only on-site Engineers Australia memorial stands a kilometre away on James Street. A 12-foot IZ pattern Southern Cross windwheel, the model Bunty Griffiths team designed in 1953, sits at the Toowoomba Visitor Information Centre. The Engineers Australia. Historic engineering marker plaque unveiled at the 2003 National Engineering Heritage Conference reads, G.H. Griffiths of Toowoomba Foundry designed and named the Southern Cross windmill in 1903, over 200,000 of which have been manufactured with wind wheels up to 36 foot 10.9 metres in diameter. The wheel turns slowly in the southerly. That is the on-site memorial. In 2019, Pentair sold the Australian windmill and tank divisions to Aaron's. Aaron's is a fifth-generation Australian family company from the Barossa Valley, founded by Heinrich Aaron's in 1906. Managing Director Stefan Aaron's told Farm Online in 2019, Southern Cross has a rich cultural significance in Australian history, and we look forward to taking this brand to another level. The brand trades today as Southern Cross Water, with windmill manufacturing still based at Whithcott. The brand survived. The foundry did not. Chapter 11. What Remains. Stand on the corner of Ruthven and Campbell Streets in Toowoomba in 2026. The 11-acre site that held one of the largest engine and windmill manufacturers in Australia is now a Bunnings Toowoomba North that opened in 2017. The WW2 era canteen where the staff of 1008 is gone. The moulding shop where Don Featherstone painted from 1927 is gone. The pattern shop where Bert Griffiths drew the Southern Cross in 1903 is gone. The Brooks shed and the drawing offices where the IZ pattern was laid out in 1953 are gone. All demolished in July 2015 by the Toowoomba Regional Council, despite the 2004 Queensland Heritage listing. A kilometre up James Street at the Visitor Information Centre, a 12-foot IZ pattern Southern Cross windwheel turns in the southerly. That is the on-site memorial. Lesson 1. A salesman's empire needs an inventor, son, George Washington. Griffiths bought designs and undercut competitors. The ADB is blunt. He was a salesman, not an engineer. He twice required his father's money to keep the firm solvent. His brother John Alfred was the engineering brain. His son George Herbert was the visionary designer. The 1903 Southern Cross, the product that built the empire and made the family rich, was Bert's design, not GW's. When the dynasty thinned and the inventor blood ran out, what was left was a brand and a portfolio. Brands are easy to buy. Foundries are easy to close. Apprenticeship lines are not easy to rebuild. Lesson 2. A corporate raider does not need to know what you make. Jānis Spalviņš, born Jānis Gunnars. Spalviņš in Riga in 1936, refugee to Australia in 1949, never poured iron on Ruthven Street. He never climbed a Southern Cross windmill at Allora Roma or Cloncurry. He never sat in the World War II era canteen. He owned David Jones, Woolworths, Penfolds, Peter's Ice Cream, 4 and 20 Pies, and Southern Cross. And when his debt mountain collapsed in 1991, every one of those Australian icons was thrown to the wind. The same raider who broke the Peter's Ice Cream empire broke the Southern Cross dynasty. Same decade, same playbook, same wreckage. The 1980s corporate raider wave, including Spalviņš, Bond, Skyse, Elliott and Holmes à Court, left a trail of broken Australian icons that the Heritage Register cannot list and the Tariff Register cannot protect. The foreign owners who came afterwards, Tyco and Pentair, were not the villains. They were the consequence. The villain had already finished his work and left the building on the 5th of July, 1991. Lesson 3. Heritage listing saves bricks, not foundries. The Toowoomba Foundry was added to the Queensland Heritage Register on the 7th of July 2004. 8 years later, the foundry closed. 3 years after that, the council approved the demolition of most of the heritage fabric. The Bunnings opened in 2017. The state can list a building. It cannot list a workforce. It cannot list a casting tradition. It cannot list a 141-year apprenticeship line. It cannot list the knowledge in the hands of the men and women who walked out of the gates on the 29th of June 2012 and never poured iron again. Heritage protection saves bricks. It does not save industries. Out in the paddocks, the lone Southern Cross silhouette against the country sky is still the silhouette. The Aarons family at Withcott is still building the IZ. The Mendoran mill that Mr. R. Gavin bought in 1924 pumped for 73 years. C16-106, Pride of Toowoomba, steamed under her own power again in October 2021 and runs every weekend in 2026. Something like 250,000 Toowoomba windmills are scattered across the continent, turning slowly in the southerly. The wheel still squeaks. The vein still groans. The empire of windmills is still alive. The empire that built them is a Bunnings car park.